in Baluvin. My maternal village is in Baluvin, a district located in the west part of Cameroon. This beautiful village is mostly home to farmers like my family who cultivate corn, peanut, and beans. Having no water supply network, we rely on the rainwater and the rivers for water to irrigate our fields and supply us with drinking water. We were a family of 8 people. We live well and practice agriculture. Our crops were sold on the market days, which allow us to provide for our needs. Unfortunately, in 2019, the river that supplied us with water for drinking and our crops began to dry out gradually. The name of this river was Douwe, which means the river of God. It was called this because we believed that it was a gift from God. But when then saw our source of water start to dry up, and within 2 years, it was completely gone. The drought that made our river run dry was happening because our rains become very increasingly scarce due to climate change. Faced with this threat to our family, my parents decided to send me back to the city of Yaoundé to purpose to escape to the crisis. I was not alone. There were several young people in the village who, like me, escaped the drought in order to seek a future in the city. Unfortunately, we had no choice but to migrate to the city to escape from famine and poverty. The way of life and the culture in the city was so different from that in my village. I was forced to accept that was I am abandoning my agricultural knowledge, which is a symbol of our cultural identity associated with the other customs such as the practice of Schie and Congress, which are the gathering during which we will receive advices from our parents and ancestors of the village through their stories. Besides, the more the time passed, the more Yemba, which is my local language, is substituted by French and English, which are the languages spoken here in the city of Yaoundé. I can see my cultural roots disappear, like we saw the Dundum River disappear. This situation that I live is one that many other families like mine around the world are facing. Therefore, we call on developed countries to provide new and additional funding to support developing countries and communities like mine to address loss and damage from climate change. So this is my story that presented. Thank you very much for your listening, for your kind attention. Thank you very much to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Such a powerful story which unpacks what we're going to be talking about today. I hope that you can stay with us as we go into the discussion later, as I'm sure there are going to be questions for you. So now I'm going to hand over to Guy Jackson, who's going to introduce what non-economic loss and damage is.
Thanks, Douwe, and thanks, Paul, for that amazing story, and thanks for being involved in this to really bring colour to some of the more conceptual things we'll speak about. So I'm going to present what and also why and how. And so Karen would have originally presented what, but I'll do it in her place. And that was very nice. You said she's here in spirit. I'm sure she is. Those climate change impacts. So the definition of loss and damage is actually there's the policy of loss and damage, which is often you'll see as capital L&D. So that's what you associate with as the third pillar of climate governance. So adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage. And so that's got a undefined in a sense, but that's the policy process. In the science of loss or science of loss and damage, we often refer to loss and damage as those climate change impacts that cannot or will not be adapted to. And these have been termed losses and damages. Loss and damage really is about, there's been a focus on economic loss and damage. So things that are traded within markets. That can be houses, cars, material possessions, these sorts of things. So when there's a disaster, a climate-related disaster, often these things will be valued first. Non-economic loss and damage are things that are not traded in markets. So they could be intangible or tangible, and they're things that people have, they're of value to people. And because of this, they're very subjective. And so the categories below on the screen are the UNFCCC's non-economic loss categories. I won't get too far into that discussion on the difference between loss and damage and losses, although I will say that we took a position in this report saying that damages are very important, because a thing that is damaged, say it could be pastoral land, it could be a village, or some sort of human resource, something that they're used, it can be damaged over time, which leads to a loss, but it's repairable. So focusing on damages we think is important because it allows for intervention to repair something before it is lost. The UNFCCC, however, only focuses on losses, but these are their categories, which are still very useful. So they consider life, health, human mobility, territory, cultural heritage, indigenous knowledge, societal cultural identity, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. However, because it's their subjective values, they're potentially infinite, and you have to understand the cultural context and the differences between people in one place. So for someone who has a relationship, a cultural relationship to a particular plant, although there's a material loss, say, which impacts food security, that could be massively connected to their indigenous knowledge, cultural heritage. And to understand the non-economic loss and damage, we have to understand the person and where the loss and damages is happening. So this is a very sort of embedded concept that's relational insofar as it's about humans relate to the environment and relate to each other. And non-economic loss and damage is really an argument to look beyond those material economic impacts, because most climate change impacts are actually non-economic. They're not actually traded within markets, which is a narrow view of human worth and the environment and everything like that. So non-economic loss and damage looks at that. We also I just want to briefly introduce some other examples. So sense of place is another sort of thing that you'll find in the literature. Social fabric is a really interesting point and crucial to what it means to be a person in a community, and dignity. So these are some other sort of things that can be impacted by loss and damage, and we'd call this non-economic loss and damage. Next slide, please, Theo. So I'm just gonna go through quickly on the why and the how. So the first point I'll make is that although there's we have to look into the past to understand our present. So why have we had an unsustainable development? Why are we experiencing climate change? And now I have here on the slides capitalism linked growth imperative and connected to fossil fuel use. But of course, it goes back even further than that. It's about our relationship with the environment and how we use resources. But really, capitalism led to growth imperative, so profit motive, which also dispossessed peasants from their lands, which became commodified, which pushed people into urban areas and towns, which encouraged commodity markets for goods, which were previously subsistence. So that was the beginning of this really unsustainable story. And that spread around the world through capitalism, through colonialism and imperialism. And now most economies around the world are capitalist, or if not capitalist, they're driven by the growth imperative, GDP growth and everything like that. So when we're talking about loss and damage, we're talking about why there were emissions in the first place. So we try to emphasize the causality in this brief and explain the document. Another thing on why, I want to touch on, is that alongside cumulative emissions, vulnerability to climate change is also worsening. So climate change is the process that leads to more common extreme events, slow onset events like droughts and sudden onsets, so cyclones and extreme rainfall, precipitation events, and slow onset processes like sea level rise and glacial retreat. So it's the emissions and how it interacts with the climate system leading to these impacts, but the emissions interact with vulnerability. So why are particular people more vulnerable than other people, which links to political economic processes of uneven development, which links to inequalities within and between societies, so at the nation state, within societies, and at the international level. And there's also historical responsibility in the emissions themselves. So the global north has emitted the most, and they have a responsibility due to that historical emission. And often those countries that had emitted the most are considered the least less vulnerable. Now, that's not always true. There's pockets of vulnerability within wealthy countries too. And so we should make sure we emphasize that. But generally, vulnerability maps with emissions. So Europe and the US have high emissions and relatively low vulnerability or capacity or financial capacity to actually adapt. And those countries that are emitted least often have high vulnerability. So to understand NELDs and why they're happening, we have to understand vulnerability. And we also need to understand adaptation limits. So this means that many countries are in no position to prepare for escalating climate impacts. Poverty, debt, overburdened bureaucracies, and lack of technical skills are all examples of factors that make effective and sustainable adaptation impossible. So when adaptation fails, loss and damage begins. 30 years of inaction in mitigation has led us to this position. So when the UNFCCC process first started, if we took the science seriously and we reduced emissions, we wouldn't be in this position. We chose the term past the point of no return because from now on, there is going to be non-economic loss and damage and economic loss and damage going forward. So now is the time for action to reduce our emissions, to reduce vulnerability, and to address loss and damage and not neglect those losses and damages that are outside of the market. That means so much to what it means to be a human being in the world today. Yeah, so I will, and I'll just, one last point on direct and indirect impacts. I'll just read this. They may be directly linked to an adverse climate impact when a cultural site, but they may be indirect, where something affects, like a crop is lost in drought, but then it leads to food insecurity later down the line. And then it can be direct or indirect. So that was the last point, but that I'll leave it there and let others speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guy. And what we're going to do now is just take a little pause, a little interactive pause. And what should be being pasted into the chat now is a Mentimeter. Thank you so much, Douwe. And what we're asking you to do is to access that Mentimeter to answer the questions we've got there. And there's a question for each section of this presentation. The first one, of course, is what is NELD? And what you'll find when you click that link is you can enter 10 answers to that question. You don't have to answer 10, you can answer 1, and then it will allow you to go on to the next questions. And we're going to return after each section of the presentation to see what you think is causing NELD, how it's happening, and your other responses. So please do click on that link, enter some things so that we can start to see what you think causes NELD on the screen. And if not, we're going to have to, not brilliant. We've got some intangible losses coming in, subjective losses, health, psychological impacts, fracture of community, invaluable loss, loss of identity, something that Paul talked about earlier. Others coming in now. Access to education, mobility, nature. Identity again, we've got identities twice. It's invaluable loss. Psychological impacts, loss of languages. More and more things coming in. You've got 30 seconds to add more. The most important stuff, I like that one. The most important issue. Heritage and culture. Places, grief, stress, traditions. You've got 10 seconds. Get your last answers in. Making future plans. Worrying about the future. Accessing intangible, psychological impacts. Further proof that the numbers of NELs are infinite. Look how many answers there are. Excellent, thank you so much. We're going to return to that later when we get to the next question. For now, on with the talk. So now I'm going to hand over to Anna Carthy.
Thanks so much to you and to Guy and Paul as well. So I'm going to talk about where NELD is occurring and who's most affected. So as I'm sure everyone can imagine, NELD is occurring all over the world, but they are being disproportionately experienced by those in the global south, because loss and damage is being disproportionately experienced by those in the global south. And that's due to historical, geographic, structural, and socio-political factors. So that really importantly relates to the political and historical context of climate coloniality, and the fact that the ability of countries in the majority world to cope and adapt with climate impacts has been undermined by both the violence and destruction of the colonial era and the colonial continuities of today's global racial capitalism. So while countries of the global south or the majority world are disproportionately affected by NELD, it's really important also to note that NELD is experienced by different people in different places very differently. It's very context specific, and it's influenced by intersectional identities, by values, and lived experiences. So a key example of where NELD is occurring is from the small island states, which are faced with the existential risk of rising sea levels. So some recent research from the Pacific Islands identified 8 different interconnected dimensions of NELD experienced by Pacific Islanders at the moment. And those include health and well-being, ways of being, future ways of being, cultural sites and sacred places, indigenous and local knowledge, life-sustaining tools, biodiversity and ecosystem services, and connection to land and sea. And our brief, also, you can see on the slide here, has a map that shows a range of other examples of NELD, from Louisiana, Puerto Rico, and Peru, to Bangladesh and Pakistan, to Sweden and the UK, to Tanzania, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and South Africa. And in the brief, we elaborate 2 specific cases, so one in the global north and one in the global south, to show that really context-specific nature of NELD. So these are the Indian and Pakistan heat waves of 2022, first of all. So I'm sure everyone in the virtual room knows that India and Pakistan experienced this early spring heat wave this year between March and April, which was made 30 times more likely due to climate change. And the true cost to human health and well-being, ecosystem services, biodiversity, heritage, identity, and social relations can't be known without reliable data. But we do know that there were 280 direct deaths, that extreme heat and elevated nighttime temperatures caused significant physical and mental health impacts. And the prolonged heat also impacted glaciers in the north of India, with the government saying that climate change is an existential crisis. And farmers who were already in debt were pushed to the brink by this extended heat and the impact on crops. And many of them have been dispossessed of their land and other livelihood assets. And more recently, in the same year, Pakistan was hit with massive flooding, which killed over 1,500 people. And those floods displaced an estimated 30 million people. And when people are forced to leave their homes, often moving to urban areas, that displacement causes impacts to cultural heritage, to sense of place, to identity, among a range of other NELs. But this record monsoon rain and flash flooding that happened in Pakistan also caused serious damage to major heritage sites, including several World Heritage sites, as well as some other less renowned sites, including Clothes and Craft Museum. And UNESCO actually pledged $350,000 to safeguard some of the World Heritage sites. But this has raised questions around the long-term sustainability and commitment to restoring and protecting these key locations in the face of the existential threat of climate change. And it's not just the built heritage that came under threat. The displacement of people and livelihoods endangered other intangible heritage, such as, for example, the art of address printing. So that's an old technique of block printing that's made specifically in the southeastern province of Sindh, and it's also at risk following the floods. So Irfan, a member of the NEL expert group, is going to talk more later about the monsoon flooding in Pakistan, but this is just a small example of the range of different non-economic losses and damages that have been experienced in the country just this year alone. So in the briefing, we also include a European example, the flooding that occurred in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands last year in 2021 in the summer. And no studies have yet calculated the full range of NELs, but 200 people died, and there was widespread coverage of the emotional toll of this particular climate event, especially the trauma of those who lost loved ones and those whose missing loved ones' bodies were never recovered. Belgium also declared a day of mourning in the aftermath of the flooding. And in one German care home, all 12 residents on the ground floor were trapped and drowned. And these were all people living with disabilities. And the health system and early warning system didn't manage to protect this group, which just shows that different groups experience NELs in different ways based on intersectional marginalization. And that brings us quite smoothly onto the question of who is most affected by NELs. So those who experience NELs are not just one single homogenous group. Understanding who is disproportionately affected requires being sensitive to multiple worldviews, to different ethical systems, the values that people hold. And because NELD is so context specific, it really requires understanding those intersectional factors such as gender, race, class, caste, disability, and many others, and the structural determinants that create uneven vulnerability to climate change in different contexts. So different people are differently vulnerable to NELD, and that relates to these unequal power relations between groups along intersectional lines, which create privilege and security for some, while generating vulnerability and marginalization for others. So in the brief, we outline a few different social groups that are recognized as being disproportionately affected by NELs. And the first that we touch upon is Indigenous people. So the colonial and post-colonial eras have already imposed huge losses on Indigenous communities, and climate change is just adding to those losses and damages. And particularly because the relationality between people, land, water, and non-human life, which are recurring principles of different Indigenous communities, heighten their experience of non-economic loss and damage. So while the loss of a forest from a wildfire may be distressing for a non-Indigenous person, for Indigenous peoples in that area, it may lead to a deeper sense of loss due to the loss of interconnection, totem species, sacred places, medicine, and knowledge. So for example, in Chitrakoot in India, the Indigenous Kol community used their traditional knowledge of medicinal plants to treat humans and livestock. However, many of those plants are now disappearing due to a reduction in water sources because of climate change. And that represents not just the functional loss of medical treatment now, but also the more fundamental loss of Indigenous knowledge and cultural practices. So while Indigenous people have, it's very well accepted, contributed the least to emissions historically, they have disproportionate vulnerability to NELs because of their marginalization and the connection for them between culture, identity, place, and nature. We also discussed in the brief a range of other groups, including economically, socially, and politically marginalized people. So reams of climate change and disaster research over the several decades has shown that those who are most marginalized in a society are the most vulnerable to shocks and stressors. And this is also true for non-economic loss and damage. So those who are marginalized based on the intersectional factors that I mentioned earlier, including disability, class, caste, or membership of a sexual or gender minority, often tend to have limited access to resources. They own few assets, they may have low income, or rely on natural resources for their livelihood. And those factors and the dependence on nature for subsistence in the context of increasingly unpredictable climate really puts these groups at a higher risk of NELs. And this also relates to gender, because gendered power dynamics significantly shape the experiences of non-economic loss and damage. So if we jump to the next slide, finally, the last group I'm going to mention is children who are affected by climate-related disasters in a range of ways, including loss of education and missed school days, but also in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder and mental health issues. So for example, almost 93% of children who frequently face tidal floods in the Tirto districts in Indonesia experience anxiety, and 29% of them have mild depression. And beyond the immediate impacts, children and future generations also face this future of escalating NELs that Guy was talking about. And the evidence shows that many young people are already experiencing climate and ecological grief. And this idea of distress caused by environmental or climate change is captured in the term solastalgia. So on the next slide is a piece of art from an exhibition on solastalgia by the wonderful artist Maya Adams, which is curated according to the Kubler-Ross model of grief. And that those psychological impacts of NELD are really important and really critical to keep in the picture. And as Guy was saying, they're frequently the first to be missed out in calculations or estimations or discussions of loss and damage. So although it's really impossible to observe and measure, future generations should really be acknowledged in NELD research and policy. And with that, I'm going to wrap up and pass back to Theo. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Hannah. We're going to go back very quickly to the Mentimeter, which hopefully is going to come into the chat for us once I find the next question. And we're going to the next question, which is, where is NELD happening? So you've got approximately 20 seconds because we need to catch up on time to add to this one. And you can just go straight to the same link and you just need to click through to the next questions. Hopefully you'll be able to do that. Don't know if there's trouble there. We can't see any answers coming in. If too difficult, we will move on and hopefully come back at the end. Okay, let us return to the presentation. Bear with me. So in the next section, we're going to hear from Douwe on how we can respond to NELD, the critically important question.
Yes, here I am. Also, I think that I think the Mentimeter had some problems. That's why we're not responding. Yeah. But I'm sure we can catch up after this segment. So this is basically the last part of the report. And after this, we have a discussion. So I'm talking about how we can respond to NELD. So you've heard why it happens and what it exactly is and who it affects. But how can we actually respond to these non-economic losses and damages? And in the report, we kind of dissected this into 3 phases. So we have documenting, measuring, and addressing. And I'll go through all of these, and then I'll end with a case study as well. So research on non-economic loss and damage is still a little bit in its infancy. We have around, as far as we know, around 16 case studies on non-economic loss and damage. And these are predominantly in the Pacific Islands and South Asia, so India and Bangladesh. But it's important that we have to encapsulate all non-economic loss and damages from different cultures because, as was previously stated, non-economic loss and damage is so heavily localized, so dependent on the local context. So when you document non-economic loss and damages, most researchers use techniques such as interviews or focus group discussions, but it's quite difficult to identify non-economic loss and damage. People do not always know that an impact on their lives is caused by climate change or by climatic events. Therefore, researchers often use these categories that you've seen before to kind of categorize non-economic loss and damage while documenting, but this also kind of confines non-economic loss and damage to these set categories, while it's a very broad concept. There's more than 1,000 ways that you can experience loss. So there's quite some challenges for documenting non-economic loss and damage, and the last one is also the ethical challenges. So non-economic loss and damage includes mental health, and it includes the loss, the death of loved ones. And when you want to talk with people about this can cause them to experience this pain again, and maybe even cause further health. But it also can, for example, include China ecological issues, which are taboo in some cultures. So yes, the ethics is very important when documenting NELD. Then the second part, measuring. So the UNFCCC released a report in 2013 in which they proposed 4 ways in which we can measure non-economic loss and damage. And the first one is economic evaluation. The second one is a multi-criteria decision analysis. The third one is risk indices. And the fourth one are qualitative and semi-quantitative tools. So you'll often see that studies measuring NELD use the last one because it's the easiest. A lot of people call for percentages and numbers when we talk about NELD, and they maybe want to talk about financial compensation. But it's not that easy, because how do you, for example, value a loss of culture or a loss of language? You can't really put a percentage on this. And moreover, its value is very subjective. For one person, losing a language can mean a lot more than for another person. Or when we're talking about family heirlooms, this is very relevant for this culture, for this person, but maybe not for another. So it can differ per country, it can differ per community, but it can even differ per individual. So how do you put a value on these things? And the last one is attribution. So yeah, how do you attribute NELD to climate change? It's often very indirect, so it can happen through a lot of complex dynamics. So yes, how can we exactly say that something is because of climate change, and then how far is it from climate change? The last part is addressing. So yeah, I already talked a bit about financial compensation. Financial compensation often comes up in the loss and damage debate and also in the NELD debate. But again, let's say that someone loses their language or a family heirloom. I don't think, I think a lot of people agree that just monetary compensation is not enough. This does not help the problem at all. And then we also have, I don't have it here on the slide, but we also have acknowledgement. A lot of people talk about acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is a good step, but we also need some concrete action. And concrete action can be dissected into 3 phases: current responses, new responses, and local responses. So current responses are already responses that are already out there. So for example, one category of non-economic loss and damage is health. And we have healthcare and we have mental health support. We also have lots of initiatives against biodiversity loss. So these initiatives are already helping to address non-economic loss and damage. Karen McNamara did a study in the Pacific Islands in which she looked at addressing non-economic loss and damage. And there people called for awareness campaigns, they called for education, they called for therapy. And the last part is looking at local ways to address non-economic loss and damage. I will highlight this a bit more because I did a case study on this in Bangladesh, but non-economic loss and damage takes place in a community and in context that people are already experiencing this for generations. Like, for example, in Bangladesh, flooding is a part of life. So they have already developed mechanisms and ways to address the impacts of floods. Yeah, can you maybe go to the next slide there? So we did a case study in Bangladesh and we went to the southwest. Here you see the image, that's the Bay of Bengal. And the red dot is where we went with ICCCAD, the International Center for Climate Change Adaptation. And we looked first, maybe you can go to the next slide there. The first part of the research was documenting non-economic loss and damage. And the second part is how are people already addressing non-economic loss and damage? So we looked at a multitude of losses and damages. So we looked at culture, we looked at biodiversity, we looked at mental health, but I just put 3 examples here to kind of illustrate what non-economic loss and damage exactly is in the field, but also how people are already addressing non-economic loss and damage. One is decreased place attachment. So people felt less attached to their homelands because of the perpetual impacts of climate hazards. And in response, they replanted trees and they protected wild-growing trees and they fortified embankments. So they were kind of making their area more secure to increase their place attachment. People experienced that they could not grow religious flowers that they, for example, needed for the puja. The puja is a Hindu ritual in which you sacrifice flowers and light and fruits. But they could not really grow these trees anymore, these fruit trees. So what they did was they increased fertilized usage. fertilizer usage, but they also had to buy goods at the market now. And then the third one, which I thought was quite interesting, is we observed marriage complications for men. So in Bangladesh, you have arranged marriages, and men from disaster-struck areas that are perpetually hit by climate disasters, face complications in finding a partner, because families from other regions, they would not marry their daughters to men in these areas, because that would mean that their daughters would move to the disaster area, and they did not want their daughters to grow up facing cyclones and facing floods. And in response, men relocated during the marriage process. So these are all local responses. And if you can go to the next slide, Theo. We can learn from these responses, but they're not always perfect. For example, buying goods at the market is not a complete response to a non-economic loss and damage. But we can learn from them, and we can look at them, and we can enhance these current practices that they are already doing, and we can increase the capacity of communities to respond to non-economic loss and damage. Yeah, so that's a little focus on local responses. And I think that was the last slide. And I think I'm handing over the word to Irfan now. Can you go to the next slide, too?
What we're actually going to do is we're going to try one more time to go back to the Mentimeter very quickly and to see if it works before hearing from Irfan. If that's okay. So I'm going to try a bit of magic and try and make it responsive so that you can all access it. But maybe it's not going to work.
I've added a new link into the chat.
Added a new link. Thank you so much.
Well.
I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. Apologies. I think let's, oh no, it is working. No. I think we're going to have to abandon and move on again. Sorry, apologies on my part. So without further ado, I will hand over to Irfan, who is a NELs non-economic loss expert group member, which is a body under the UNFCCC, where he represents the UNFCCC's youth constituency, YOUNGO. So we're very privileged to have Irfan here today, where he'll be speaking about not only what he wrote in the foreword for the brief, but also where we're at with addressing NELD in the UNFCCC.
Yeah, thank you so much to you and the team. And yeah, first of all, thanks to all the author and also the speaker of this this debriefing. I think so. It's really important that more work need to be done, especially on non-economic losses, because it's, I think so, one of the overlooked aspect of economic loss and damages. So yeah, briefly talking about where are we now? So we are now across the climate affected country that economic loss and damages are often assessed and reported of a disaster. However, non-economic losses from climate change are often overlooked, and the importance of non-economic losses and damages has also historically been neglected at climate negotiation as well, to be honest, because whenever you see this different conferences and even like SBs and COP, so you can somehow realize the focuses there is more also on economic losses, but the aspect of economic losses and non-economic losses and damages have been missing for a long time. But why? So I will not talk more into deep, because other speaker already have mentioned that why is it important and why it need to be addressed. But so, for example, if we didn't consider it and if we put less focus on non-economic loss and damages, for sure it will worsen inequality among the vulnerable community and will impede the effort of climate resilient community. And one of the missing gap that we usually see that an economic loss and damage assessment are mostly focusing on monetary values, but there are loss and damages which cannot be quantified, like other speaker mentioned, like for example, loss of ecosystem, culture, and life. And it's really important that we really need to assess, we really need to kind of consider and address it. So as we all know, as the temperature increases, the vulnerable country will face more non-economic loss and damages, and especially in global south. And if we see coming 10 or 20 years down the road, and if NELs are not considered, so maybe NELs will pile up and will get more severe in comparison to economic losses. And briefly talking about what are the challenges currently, if we talk about addressing quantification of non-economic loss and damages. So first on the list is quantifying non-quantifiable. It's challenging to put a take price on. So for example, if someone lost his or her life, how you put a price on it, you know? So it's, as the other speaker mentioned, it's too subjective and it's too challenging to put a price tag on these loss and damages. And also there's also not a unified existing quantification measures for NEL, non-economic loss and damages, that is like approach that we can use it, a unified approach or mechanism. How to tackle this, those challenges. So I think so innovation is the key. So we really need to work more on this overlooked area of non-economic loss and damages, and the academia and the other multi-stakeholder really need to come up with more innovation, how to best address this area, and also to have the collaborative work between academia, NGOs, INGOs, UN agency. We really need to come together, and we also really need to have coordination, but not competition. A lot of organization, you can see, you know, there's this race, you know, competing for resources, but I think it would be nice that we come together, work together, have a collaboration in coordination, and together I think so we can really somehow tackle this these challenges of the measurement of non-economic loss and damages. And yeah, before wind up, I also really need to briefly talk about what need to be done and what needs to happen. So yeah, to address and fund economic and non-economic loss and damages, it's still a big gap in international climate governance structure. And as the country climate delegation are now preparing for the coming COP in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and it's also the images of the recent massive human suffering as a result of climate change, especially back in my country, Pakistan, and also the recent flooding in Nigeria will be prominent in everyone's minds, and it will provide an exhibit that serious consideration must be done to operationalize Santiago network on loss and damage, and also the loss and damage finance facility. And there should be also a more clear and particular focus on the aspect of non-economic loss and damages. And it is the best time to work the climate talk, as reactor and ad hoc pledges are insufficient. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Over to you.
Thank you so much, Irfan. And what we're going to do now is we're going to open the floor to questions, and please either raise your hand and hopefully I'll be able to see you. Otherwise, please ask your questions in the chat and I can read them out or put you on the spot. We've already got one question in the chat, I believe, if not more, and the first one being from Stephen. Stephen, I don't know if you want to come in and ask that question, otherwise I'm happy to read it out for you.
Hi, yeah, can you see me?
Yeah.
Oh, we've still got the the display on there. Yeah, I just thought I imagine what you do, rather than try and get an absolute value on what the loss is because it's qualitative, you ask people on the ground, well, what's most important to you, and decide what you address first.
Do come in any speakers who want to share thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, I can come in. So I think, indeed, I think that's a good point. I think some case studies are out there that do this, and we see now as well with loss and damage in general that we see more needs assessments and asking the people, okay, what do you need? For example, the Scottish government, their funding of COP, part of it went to needs assessments in Africa and South America. But as far as I know, there's no NELD specific needs assessment now. I'm working on one currently. But yeah, I agree completely that this is a good way to go. We don't necessarily need to put the number on it if they can express what they want to see addressed most. in that way, you can kind of prioritize and rank needs.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to come in to ask a question? I'm going to stop sharing so I can better see everybody. Is there any comments from the speakers, having listened to each other? Have you reflected in any different ways about what you've heard?
I was just going to mention as well, if anyone wants to come in and just share their own experience as well, we're open to that. I have just a discussion. But yeah, just reflection, really insightful. And I hope everyone got some value from it. And also just wanted to raise the point that like this is early days. Like there's a sort of like the slow pace of research and that sort of temporality where we do research carefully and, you know, that takes years to come out. And then there's the actual material reality of what is happening now. And I think, Irfan, you'd fully agree, like, you know, the discourse in the whim can sometimes get caught on the technical details when there's actually this ongoing loss and damage right now. And I suppose both have their role, but there's like a urgency, right? But there's also a need for careful research, and I suppose our positionality as scholars is to do that sort of slower research. But then for other actors like the social movements that are putting pressure, you know, they're the ones that really got NELD centered in this whole thing. Like the only reason like governments are starting to take it seriously is because of that bottom-up pressure. And then we can add our value by providing resources such as this to get discussion going and give tools to people to then how they engage politically and socially and things like that. I suppose just a comment I had when I was thinking about how we engage.
Anna?
Yeah, just to come in as well on that question around the hierarchy of needs. I think, first of all, Douwe's point is really important that, yes, making sure that NELD is included in assessments is the first step in doing that, to make sure that the information is being gathered to figure out what elements are a priority, rather than the focus always being on the kind of economic losses. But secondly, I think that really brings to mind the importance of work at the local level, because those hierarchy of needs will look different for different people and they'll look different in different places. So that's not something that could be aggregated at a global level, for example. So I think that just maybe really emphasizes the importance of support mechanisms and finance to address loss and damage, and support mechanisms for non-economic loss and damage, specifically putting power and authority in the hands of people who are experiencing it and who know firsthand what their priorities are, rather than trying to come up with bureaucratic global mechanisms that won't be able to fully address those needs.
Thank you so much, Anna. We've got a hand up from Sandeep, so I will hand over to you, Sandeep. Perhaps if you can introduce yourself as well.
Thanks to you. Hi, everyone. My name is Sandeep Salmurai. I'm Senior Advisor on Global Climate Adaptation Policy for WWF. Well, it's not a comment, it's more as a remark that from my point of view, I think like what Irfan has said, the NEL issue has not been really moving forward because of some technical issue, especially if you look at the country level. Many of the countries are not been well aware in terms of what the loss and damage are. And if you look from the NDC point of view, I think it's only it was Vanuatu, who has really quantified the loss and damage in terms of real number, but I have not seen others. But what we really need moving forward on this particular agenda item is basically, once we agree on the Santiago network at COP27, then how the Santiago network can really help at the country level to do their non-economic loss assessment on top of the, I would say, economic loss assessment, because that's a critical. As we all know, IPCC has really clearly outlined many of the non-economic losses, but if you go back to the country level, it has not been really quantified as such. So I would say we firstly need to set a baseline in terms of what are the country, I would say, different non-economic losses that every country faces. And I think Santiago Network will be a good platform where we can really link that and be able to mobilize the Santiago network much more strongly. And later on, and based on that assessment, we can definitely do some of the how to minimize and address loss and damage from non-economic losses and damages in the later part, and also feeding into the GST process. So just to add some of my reflection in terms of moving forward, we need to really engage with the Santiago network along with our national government as well in terms of understanding and identifying the NEL issues. Over.
Thank you so much, Sandeep, for those very wise words. I just want to give an opportunity to anyone from the panel to respond to Sandeep before we go on to the next question.
I just think Sandeep's comments were like, yeah, very, very useful. And just observations with being to some conferences, international loss and damage conferences lately, in the discourse in general, the national level is often skipped. Like you'll go from a local to an international, and actually what happens at the nation state through NDC processes and everything else is super important. So Sandeep, yeah, I really agree. I suppose the only comment I would have would be that is definitely needs to happen, like at a national level and at a regional level within countries, to have the mechanisms to actually record so we actually know what we're dealing with, which is a legal and political strategy, of course, and just the responsibility of national governments. But then also recognize that at the same time, we really need to avert and minimize these losses as they're going on. But I think we can do that through risk reduction and vulnerability reduction processes too. So I don't think those two things are one or the other, it's both at the same time. But great comments. Thank you, Sandy.
Thanks so much, Guy. And anyone else before the next raised hand? Okay, I'd like to hand over to Bright. Apologies if I'm not saying your name correctly, but please do introduce yourself.
All right, thank you very much. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll be quick. Thank you for the presentation. It was great. However, I just wondering, maybe do you have any international policy framework which can help to address an economic loss? Thank you.
Someone who'd like to respond beyond what's already been said about the UNFCCC?
So policy framework, international policy framework, was that correct? Yeah, I mean, typically it is being.
Yes.
Yes. So, I mean, I sometimes feel that, so those people who have been work with the COP and going to every COP and things like that are getting frustrated with the slow progress, and sort of we're limited by our focus over. I mean, it's really, really important to focus on the UNFCCC process and have those mechanisms in place. But then sometimes, you know, what we've seen with nation state governments doing bilateral engagement with countries, or putting money, but there's no real comprehensive framework as such to deal with NELs or loss and damage in general. I mean, ethically, the common but differentiated responsibilities is meant to drive the UNFCCC, but we see in practice that it's not really provided any concrete steps. So that's some seriously important work we need to do to see what that sort of architecture at the international level would look like. And I think that's a big gap. And thank you so much for your comment, because yeah, but that just shows that there's a long way to go, basically.
To anyone else who wanted to come in, I was just going to pick up on a comment in the chat. Okay, so in response to Caitlin's comment, at the end of the comment, they asked the question, I'd be interested in ideas on how to introduce people to different value systems. One of the things picked up in the brief is that we need both interdisciplinary collaboration, we need different ways of working, and particularly an understanding of the different value systems, the different way people hold values and see the world. So can you offer any advice, panel?
So I can briefly talk. I think it's a very good question, and I think it's maybe a question that we don't really have an answer for. Because yes, we have lots of different cultures and we have lots of different values, and everyone attaches a different value to an item. So yes, like I think it's a very interesting research question that we should maybe think about more as we proceed, but I don't really necessarily have an idea or like an insight.
And I'll hand over to Anna, who wants to respond.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up also on another comment in the chat from Sobia Kapadia, who said the idea of loss is so ingrained in the capitalist ideas related to efficiency and internalized greed, where climate change impacts are supposed to have larger losses to the rich and less around poor people who don't have much to lose. However, their bouncing back mechanism and access to resources are not seen as loss and damage at the state level. I wanted to pick up on this because I think that's a really interesting point, particularly in relation to informal and undocumented economies and settlements. So, for example, if I have two people and one person has like 5 cars and 3 houses, and another person lives in an informal settlement and is working to feed their family and doesn't own many assets beyond their home in this informal settlement, then in economic terms, the losses of the person who has lots of cars and houses and lots of means is financially far more significant than the loss of, for example, the loss of one of those houses to that person. They still have another house to go to. They still have several cars. They still have, a safety net to fall back on. Whereas the loss of a house to the person who's living in this informal settlement has a much more significant impact on their life and livelihood. And so that's one of the other issues with the measurements of loss and damage in economic terms that we haven't so much touched on in this brief. This brief really focuses on how economic measurements of loss and damage overlook all of the non-economic impacts that we've discussed today, but they also overlook all of those informal livelihoods and assets that are not documented or are not quantified at the national level. And so I totally agree with that point in the chat. I think it's a really important thing to also be considering in terms of the deficiencies of measuring loss and damage only in economic terms and only with the measurements that are being used at the moment, because it really doesn't capture the actual impact of losses on a person's life, and that wouldn't definitionally wouldn't fall necessarily into non-economic loss and damage, because those homes could hypothetically be traded in markets. So that's why we haven't included it necessarily in this briefing, but I think it's a really important point to reflect on, and really something that also needs to be addressed in the policy intervention and action to address loss and damage. So thanks so much for raising it.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I'm aware that we've run over our hour, but and that some panelists may have to leave shortly, but for those who are still happy to answer questions, I suggest that we do another 5 minutes and then gently draw to a close. Is there anything else anybody wanted to respond to in the chat that I may not have picked up upon before we go to that hand? I did just see a hand come up, which has disappeared now.
It was my hand, and if anyone doesn't have any comment, I would like to comment on what Anna said.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you for recognizing the gap in loss and damage conversation, which I really felt, especially in Pakistan, in the recent floods, because since July, when the entire of Balochistan was underwater, nobody wanted to talk about it. And all of a sudden, in August, so 4 weeks into the terrible monsoon terrain, one image just took over of the Swat River. So this kind of, infrastructure, spatial injustices, the violence attached to this whole notion of climate change politics around governance, and the recognition of states, recognition of national government towards the population, where they have not done much to help their bouncing back mechanisms or safety nets or infrastructure development, and then expect the world to respond to the climate change vulnerabilities. I mean, I know that this conversation requires more in-depth research, but we need to hold national government responsible and accountable. That was just what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for bringing that point. I think you're totally right, and I agree. So thanks for bringing it to the space.
Do we have time for one more question, comment, story?
Absolutely. Perhaps some of those who have written in the chat would like to speak up.
Thanks for your comment, Anna, and response as well from the audience. That's such a crucial point, and it's really great to hear that as well. There was a few comments in the chat about the COP and things like that. So if anyone in the audience is going as well, a few of us will be there. So, you know, if you do stumble across us, just that we'd love to continue the discussion going. And I mean, just want to cement this is a conversation. I mean, the document we wrote is a tool, but it's mostly to get a conversation going and give an update, you know, so, but like it's important to hear that to have these sorts of events too, to hear other people and comments and stuff. So it's been a pleasure as well.
Thank you so much, Guy, and I'll just reiterate the thanks again to all of you authors and to everyone who has inputted, because it's not just the authors, it's those who have fed back, it's those who have weighed in on the discussions that we've been having as this brief has been written. And once again, I just urge you, please, if you haven't already, have a look at it, download it. You'll find both links in the chat. The short version for policymakers, just 2 pages. For those of you going to COP who don't have much time to read, and then the full-length version as well. And let us know what you think. Continue that conversation. Come and find us at COP. Send us emails. Just no matter how long. We'd love to hear your thoughts. But once again, thank you so much, everyone. We will end it there. And if, like we've said previously, if you want to know more about the loss and damage collaboration, please do email us, reach out to us on Twitter. If you want to join the the NELD working group, please do let us know. I can't speak anymore, and we will get back in touch with you. Thank you very much, all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, ciao, everyone.
Bye-bye.